Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending on where you are joining us from. It's a real pleasure to be moderating today's webinar, which continues a series of CTBTO use group online events running until December this year. I am Maria Chupurina, External Relations Officer at the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization, which prohibits nuclear explosions by everyone, everywhere, and continuously monitors the globe to ensure no nuclear testing goes undetected. I'm really thrilled to see so many of you joining us today, a lot of familiar faces, and especially a lot of members of our 900-strong CTBTO use group, which tirelessly work with us to make sure that we prohibit, definitely, the nuclear testing. This year is a very special year. Just a few weeks ago, we marked the 75th anniversary of the first ever nuclear test, the Trinity test. And from what the people who actually saw it can recall, although technically the test lasted only a couple of seconds, for them, it seemed like it lasted an eternity. And it did change forever the history of humanity. We also marked just a couple of days ago the tragedy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the dreadful human suffering caused by the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. What followed after the first nuclear test, the Trinity nuclear test, was a whole series of nuclear explosions that lasted for almost 50 years. But what also followed was an increasing global concern of the need to ban nuclear testing. But however, as we know, it takes time, hard work, and especially the right political climate to get a flame out of a sparkle. The Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was signed in 1996, and 25 years later, it's been signed by over 180 countries and ratified by over 160. However, the risk of nuclear testing still exists today. And as the CTBTO Executive Secretary, Dr. Cynthia Lazaroff would say, what we need to do is to urgently finish what we started. And this is exactly what the CTBTO use group and its task force is doing every single day. We help educate the next generation of global leaders on the risks of nuclear testing, and together we promote nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, as well as citizen diplomacy. And this is exactly what we will be talking about today, citizen diplomacy. The importance of up to the dangers of nuclear testing and of nuclear non-proliferation. And of course, about the dangers of sleepwalking into a new arms race. The experts who are joining us today embody the power of citizen diplomacy and also of making one's voice heard. Over the past 30 years, Cynthia Lazaroff, founder of the NuclearWake-UpCall.Earth and an award-winning documentary filmmaker, has been engaged in numerous track 2 citizen diplomacy initiatives, catalyzing efforts between US and Russia relations to reduce the nuclear risk. So has Vladimir Pozner, a veteran journalist, best-selling author, and an award-winning filmmaker who ranks among the most respected journalists globally today, and also among the most listened to journalists today. We are also delighted to feature today two CTBTO Youth Group members, Brenna Gautam, attorney in Washington, D.C., and the CYG Regional Coordinator for the United States, and Natalia Zhurina, a MEFI graduate, currently Education Officer at the OPANAL in Mexico, and CYG Coordinator for Eastern Europe and Russia. I also want to deeply thank the CTBTO team who actually made this event possible. Our expert meeting host, Ryan Gonzalez, Nargis, Francesca Giovannini, and many others. Thank you so much for being on our team. Without your invaluable contribution, nothing would have been possible. Last but not least, before we begin, a few words about the format and the ground rules for the meeting. Our webinar is, as you are well aware, open to public, so feel free to tweet and to quote us as much as you like. Feel also free to use the hashtag CYG webinars for us to be able to track your tweets and then to retweet them on our official page. Please also feel free to use the Q&A function to type your questions, comments, or any suggestions, which we will serve afterwards for our discussion. The webinar will be recorded and will be made publicly available. Now, let us welcome the first speaker, Cynthia. Thank you so much for joining us. I actually believe it's early morning back in Hawaii.
I said, yes, you can probably hear the roosters outside.
We do hear them. But whenever I think about you, I actually think about a date, 13th January 2018, the Hawaii missile alert. The story is extremely powerful. It still makes me shiver. Can you tell it to us? Can you share it with those people with us today?
Well, Maria, first, thank you so much for the very kind introduction, and it's really an honor to be with you and all at CYG today. And as we have just passed through, you mentioned the 75th anniversaries of the first Trinity nuclear test and the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I'm just so grateful for what you all do at CYG to work for disarmament and to bring the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty into force and non-proliferation. And the work is more important today than ever. So thank you so much for all you do and for welcoming me here today. I just want to begin by providing some context of what was going on leading up to that day, January 13th, 2018, what was going on in my life. I had spent the months of the fall before in 2017 working on a film where I had the opportunity to interview many of the top experts and former officials in US-Russia relations on nuclear dangers, both in the US and Russia. And pretty much everybody I talked to awakened me to today's staggering nuclear danger. And the two people who impacted me the most were former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev and our US former Secretary of Defense, William Perry. Secretary Perry said to me in the interview, "Today we are at a greater risk of a nuclear catastrophe than at any time in history." And he said, and most of us are blissfully unaware of this danger. And then he said, "We are sleepwalking into a nuclear catastrophe and we must wake up." Those words really penetrated and stayed with me as I made my way home from Russia, actually in December after interviewing Mikhail Gorbachev. And that December 2017 was at the height of the fire and fury between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. And the nuclear tensions were particularly high here in Hawaii because we knew that we had been marked on North Korea's map of nuclear death as a target. And we were actually getting instructions from our government here in the state about how to prepare for a nuclear attack and how to survive a nuclear attack. So all of that was going on the morning of January 13th, 2018 for me. All of that was present in my awareness and my consciousness. And that morning we awoke to an absolutely hauntingly beautiful sunrise. And it was, Ryan, if you can show that on the screen, it was really very unusual. And it was so unusual that we actually took a photograph of it, as you can see here. Very shortly after this, at 8:07 a.m., I was in the living room in that conversation, and I was one of over 1 million people in Hawaii who received this message on my cell phone at 8:07 a.m. Ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. So the first thing was I looked at my phone and I said, wait a second, how can this be possible? Is this real? And we thought, well, let's call 911 to find out. And we tried and tried. We were dialing 911 over and over again, but it was busy because, of course, everybody in Hawaii was calling 911 to try to find out if it was real at the same time, and none of us could get through. And at that point, my partner Bruce said, our girls and our younger daughters were 7 miles away in the town of Kapa'a. And he said, I don't know if this is real or not, but I'm going to go get the girls. And so he went to go out the door, and I said, wait a second. We need a plan if it is real. I don't want to be separated. He said, call me in the car and we'll figure it out. So he was out the door, and I had a moment, and I just stood there and I felt dazed. And I thought, okay, who do I know that's going to know? Who do I know that's going to know if this is real? And I thought of my friend, journalist Felicia Cowden, who really knows everybody here, and everybody takes her phone call. And I started to try to call her. I texted her. I checked her Facebook page. There was nothing. And it seemed like an eternity for me, but was only a couple of minutes. She called me back and she said, Cynthia, the county is telling us to take shelter. And the county runs our island here. So for me, that was the moment where I thought, okay, this is real. I've got to take this seriously. So the first thing was, where do we go? There are no designated nuclear shelters in the state of Hawaii. So we remembered that our neighbor has built a meditation cave deep in a hillside nearby, and we decided to shelter there. The next thing, because it was just putting one foot in front of the other, was, what do I take with me? So I looked at my phone and it had 12% charged. And I thought, oh my God. So I then looked for my phone charger and I thought, will I even be able to plug anything in the cave? And then I remembered there were lights. So I thought maybe there's an outlet. So I threw my phone charger and my phone in this bag. And then I thought my computer charger, my purse, my passport. And then it was, am I ever going to really need these things if there's a nuclear attack? I mean, is this ridiculous? And then I thought, well, no, just got to try to survive. And so I then thought, what else do I need? And a shawl to wrap around my face to protect from radiation, leggings to cover my legs for the same reason. And then I thought, oh, food and water. Oh my God, I've done nothing to prepare the family. We're supposed to have a gallon of water per day per person for 2 weeks, and enough canned food for each person per day. And there are 4 of us that are going to the cave. And I looked on the shelf and I had 2 small bottles of water, and I looked on the counter and I had a bunch of bananas because we were about to do a shopping trip to the farmer's market. And I threw everything in the bag, and then it was just, I've got to go. I've got to get in the car, even though it's only a couple of minutes walk. I don't know how many minutes we have. It could be 1 minute, it could be, I just didn't know. So I got in the car, and it was only at that moment that I allowed myself to think about our eldest daughter in LA. And I thought, oh, I've got to call Mackenzie. I've got to call her to say goodbye. So I started dialing her, and as I was driving to the cave, and it was ringing and ringing. I couldn't get through to her, and I jumped out of the car after I parked, and I was running towards the cave, and it was still ringing. And finally, at the foot of the steps to the cave, she picked up. And I said, Mackenzie, I don't know if you've heard, but we've all gotten a message on our cell phone here in Hawaii that there's a ballistic missile coming, a nuclear missile. We're going to shelter in the cave, and I just want you to know that I love you, and I'll call you again from the cave if I can. I love you. I love you. And she said to me, Mom, I love you too. And then it was just silence, and it was this moment of, am I ever going to hear her voice again? Am I ever going to see her again? And then it was, wait a second, is this much bigger than just one nuclear missile from North Korea? Is this the beginning of that accidental nuclear war that the experts were all talking about in the interviews that they're so concerned about? Were there many missiles on the way from Russia? And were we sending many missiles back? And was this the beginning of the end of life as we know it? The beginning of the end and of everything and everyone we know and love and cherish. And as I was thinking all of this in this silent moment where I didn't want to hang up the phone, my daughter screamed, "Mom, go, go, go." So at that moment, I was jolted out of those thoughts and rushed up the steps to the cave and then started up the hillside above the steps to get there. And I got to the door of the cave, and as I was about to open it, the doors opened. And it was my neighbor, Colleen, and she walked out and she was smiling and she said, it was a false alarm. It took 38 minutes for our government to send us this text message. There is no missile threat or danger to the state of Hawaii. Repeat, false alarm. And with everything that I knew about nuclear war and nuclear winter and nuclear fallout and Hiroshima and Nagasaki and nuclear winter, nuclear war was really unimaginable to me until I went through those 38 minutes. And now, really, as a mother, as a human being, it's inside of me. This experience is not going away, and it will always be with me until we eliminate nuclear weapons. So that's why I started Nuclear Wake-UpCall.Earth, and that's why I'm here today. And thank you, Maria.
This is so powerful, Cynthia. Whenever I hear it, it just makes me shiver. It's real storytelling for change. And what you were actually saying earlier is also so true, quoting Bill Perry. We're blissfully unaware of the huge nuclear risks today. And what we need to do is to wake up to this risk and to think what each and every one of us can do. You have a very active citizen position. Can you actually give a couple of examples of what you've been doing in order to wake the people around you up to the nuclear threat?
Well, Maria, first of all, a core part of the work right now is really sharing my story with the hopes that it serves to wake people up. But and that's really in line with the theme today of storytelling for change of this webinar. But waking people up is only the first step, because waking up really has to go hand in hand with action, and the two have to come together. And for me, you know, if nuclear weapons can eliminate all of us, then we all have a stake and a role to play. And we all really, it's up to all of us to come together, to work together to eliminate them. So inspired by Secretary Perry and Gorbachev and many of the experts I've interviewed, I put together something called the Nuclear Playbook, because it's really a way to try to democratize nuclear policy and change, because we all have to really take this on. It doesn't just belong to the experts and the governments. If we're going to change it, we all have to get involved. And so this Nuclear Playbook has 10 steps in it. And I would say the steps really fall into three categories. One are steps that we absolutely must take to reduce the nuclear risk, the risk of a catastrophe, so that we can be here and stay here while we do the really important thing, which is work to eliminate nuclear weapons. And the third area is to really work on restoring the dialogue with Russia and realizing that we in Russia possess over 90% of the world's nuclear weapons, and it's up to us to take the lead in reducing our arsenals. So one of the examples would be step one, that really focuses on immediately reducing the risk. An example would be that all nuclear armed states adopt a policy of no first use, which means that they declare that they will never be the first to use nuclear weapons. If this happens, this immediately reduces nuclear tensions and reduces the likelihood that in the event of a conflict, that it will escalate to the use of nuclear weapons. So that's just one of those examples. An example of how we work to eliminate nuclear weapons would be step 5, that we actually all work together to get the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons ratified by the UN. And at this point in time, there are 44 out of 50 countries needed to ratify the treaty. None of the nuclear armed states have signed or ratified the treaty, however. And so we have to really think about how do we actually get to zero nuclear weapons. And so step number 4 really highlights the program that's been put forward by Global Zero, which is a very, very thorough, well thought through pathway to zero nuclear weapons that really focuses on the US and Russia reducing their arsenals in a phased, verifiable approach to get to zero, and then coming down to the level of China and all the other countries. So that's sort of an overview of the playbook. It's on the nuclear website, NuclearWake-UpCall.Earth website. Under the Wake Up tab under Playbook, you can learn more there. But I do have to say that the playbook's always evolving with world events. And there's one step that's really missing in there right now, and it should be number 11. And when the playbook was originally put together, I had never imagined that nuclear testing would be back on the table. But as we know, the Trump administration announced in May that they were considering resuming nuclear testing. It came out in an article in May in the Washington Post. So it's really critical. It's a cornerstone and should be number 11 and will be number 11, that we really work to support the ratification of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and that we bring that treaty into force and that we ratify that treaty. And this is where really the role of CYG can take a lead.
Thank you so much for highlighting this, Cynthia. This was actually one of my suggestions to you. And thank you for this amazing nuclear playbook. I've spent quite a lot of time going through it myself. It's really beautifully done and it's hyper informative. And we have just shared the link to it in the chat function. So to those of you who are not familiar with it yet, please check it out.
Thank you.
But let us get back a little bit, 20, 30 years, to the 1980s. As you, one of the top promoters of citizen diplomacy, you have started building those ties between citizens, activist groups in US and Russia back in the days, in the 1980s. Can you tell me what were some of your main initiatives at this time, and how you can also compare citizen diplomacy back then to what we have or to what we can have today?
Well, Maria, thank you for bringing me back to that extraordinary time in history, because, you know, at that time, we were all awake to the nuclear threat. And we were all very concerned about the risk of nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union, and worried about seeing the deadlock between our governments and the high risk. And so people really all over the United States and then all over the Soviet Union just decided that they really wanted to come together to collaborate. And it was such an honor to be part of this movement of people of all ages, from all backgrounds and all walks of life, coming together to collaborate. And it was across the spectrum. It was doctors, business people, artists, musicians, journalists. It was an honor to collaborate with Vladimir at that time. He was one of the leading champions in the Soviet Union of citizen diplomacy. And it was just such a joy. I worked a lot with youth, and I worked a lot with women on exchanges. And I would say that my most beloved exchange program was really inspired by students I taught in the Soviet Union when I was on a teacher's exchange there in 1980, who dreamed of being able to go into the wilderness with their American friends someday. And it was really a dream at that time, and everybody said it would be impossible. It took 5 years to make it happen, to actually get the permission to let Soviet American kids be in the same tent together and to climb together for several weeks. And Ryan, if you want to put the photograph in the chat right now, we actually, in 1985, we actually created the first joint ascent of Mount Elbrus, which is the highest peak on the European continent. It's 18,481 feet. And we climbed together to the summit. We had 10 Soviets and 10 Americans, and it was, again, the very first ascent. We made a film about it that was broadcast on the eve of the first Reagan-Gorbachev summit, and it was really, really a demonstration of our capacity to cooperate together, to survive together, to climb to the summit together. And, you know, in the field at the time, we had this saying, not just for this project, but there was, people quoted this idea that like climbers together tethered on one rope, we can either climb together to the summit or fall together into the abyss. And I think that's where we are absolutely today at the same, again, you know, we can either really come together and climb together or fall together into the nuclear abyss because the risk is so dangerous. And you've asked about today, and I think that, you know, we face these existential threats of climate change and the pandemic. And my colleague, William Ury, you know, a world respected mediator and negotiator, has said, you know, this is time for a moonshot moment where we all come together and unify in the US and Russia and all over the world to do something for climate change. And that would be an act of citizen diplomacy for today, that we all plant trees, 1 trillion trees. If we can all come together and plant 1 trillion trees, we will show that we can do something and have a success story. And we can really do something that climate scientists would be game-changing for the climate, reduce CO2 by 25%. So that would be one way, but I think that we have to think of every possible way we can come together like we did back then and join together in exchanges of all kinds, you know, in all areas. We can do that again. And we really must do it again, especially I think in the US and Russia, because again, we have to remember that we possess so many of the world's, over 90% of the world's nuclear weapons, and we have to change our relationship. And we have to change our relationship to create the context for us to reduce our nuclear arsenals.
I couldn't help agreeing with you more on this, Cynthia. And I do think that what's really important for us is actually to try to get out of this silo thinking when we consider nuclear risks, nuclear threats, believing it's someone else's job, and linking those issues, the issues of nuclear threat, to larger issues that might be actually, you know, of higher interest to the younger generation, like, for example, climate change, can probably boost and push both of those themes higher up on the top political agenda. And this brings me to our second highly honored and highly awaited guest, Vladimir Pozner, who, as you mentioned, Cynthia, you have collaborated with him in the 1980s, and your friendship has been running since then and until now. Vladimir, you had the special also moonshot moment Cynthia was referring to when you decided to launch an absolutely innovative and unique initiative of space bridges. Can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I must underline the fact that being a journalist, I'm much more hard-nosed and much less, how should I put this, enthusiastic than Cynthia. I envy her in that sense. I wish I could be that way. Her story is an incredible story, and she tells it wonderfully. You know, storytelling is as important as the story itself. If you're not good at telling it, then the story falls flat on its face. And she tells it in a marvelous way, and I'm very touched every time I hear it. But her story is one of many. You know that there were other false alarms. There's a famous story of Brzezinski when he was the National Security Advisor, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, he got a call from General Odom, who told him that there were 20 ballistic missiles headed towards the United States, and he didn't know whether to wake up President Carter or let him die in his sleep, or what the hell was he going to do? And then he asked Odom to check, and Odom called back a second time and said, no, not 20, 200. And well, I'm not going to go through the whole story, but it turned out to be a chip, one computer chip that had failed. It cost 46 cents, that computer chip. And the world would have gone to hell, literally, had that not been discovered. And there were other, there were several of these cases when we were all on the brink of total annihilation. And I think that these are stories that should be told again and again and again. They should be brought home to, especially to younger people who seem to have never been taught about this, never really thought about this. There's a huge difference between 1985 and today. It's over 40 years. 40 years is 2 generations. And generally, they say generation is 20 years. And much has changed. And therefore, the story that I'm going to tell you about what happened back then is an interesting story, and it's a fascinating story, but I'm not at all sure that it's something that would work today in the same way. It wasn't my idea. I'd love to say I was the initiator, but I wasn't. The initiator was a man by the name of Joseph Golden, who sadly passed away several years ago, and who had this vision that if you put up huge television screens, 6 stories high, in all of the major cities around the world, and allow people to communicate, talk to each other. He said, if that were to happen, there would never be a war, because people would compare how they live. What have you got in your purse? What have I got in mine? And look at my babies. These look like your baby. These things are very powerful. They're more powerful than speeches by politicians. Well, perhaps with the exception of Abraham Lincoln, but he's not around today, sadly. So he had that vision. Of course, it wasn't going to happen, but he said we should use television because there is an abyss right now. We're not talking to each other. There was a time when President Reagan had labeled the Soviet Union as the evil empire. It was a time when Star Wars were seriously talked about by President Reagan. It was a time when all exchanges between the Soviet Union and the United States had stopped. All athletic, educational, cultural, you name it. And we were headed towards war. It was pretty obvious to a lot of people. So what were we supposed to do? And Cynthia was right when she said that many, many Americans thought about this and came to the Soviet Union. There was a huge difference in that Soviets couldn't go to America. And it wasn't because the Americans weren't letting them in, but the political system of the Soviet Union did not allow people to travel freely. It just was not possible. So in a way, it was a kind of a one-sided effort. Not that there weren't many Soviets who wanted the same thing, but they lived in a much more controlled atmosphere. When I look back on those times, I'm grateful that the Soviet government actually supported this movement, because had it not, there would have been no citizen diplomacy in the Soviet Union. You couldn't do anything without the government at least not being against it. And if you did...
Vladimir, how did you manage to advocate, to push forward this vision?
Well, because there were people who wanted to help. There was Academician Velikov, very high-standing man. There were others. We talked to people at Gosteleradio, which was the state television organization. We got people to say, yeah, it's a good idea, let's do this. And ultimately, I'm not going to go into details because it was a very long story and a very funny one at times even, because I had to, how should I put this? I had to stretch the truth to a certain extent several times. And Phil Donahue, who was supposed to be the host on the American side, asked me if I could guarantee that this space bridge would be on the air. And I said yes, but I couldn't, of course. But I wanted it so badly that I decided, to hell with that, I'm going to say that I can. And I did several things like that to make it happen. And it did happen. It finally did happen. There was this hookup between Seattle and Leningrad. There were 200 plus people in each studio. Phil Donahue, who I'd never met in my life before, and myself. And I'd like to make a point there that nobody knew me in the Soviet Union because I'd never been allowed to go on television inside the Soviet Union. I'd been on American television via satellite. I'd been on Nightline and a bunch of other shows, but nobody here knew me. So there we were facing each other. And, you know, at the distance, you have Seattle way over there on the West Coast and Leningrad. And the first symbol that came up were the handshake with a sleeve with the American flag and a sleeve with the Soviet flag. Couldn't believe our eyes, for God's sakes, that this was happening, you know? And it was the first time I'd ever been in that kind of a television studio with a big audience. Anyway, it opened up and all the Soviets, not all, but many had come with presents that they wanted to give their American counterparts. And I had said, how are you going to give them presents? I mean, they're several thousand miles away. No, it doesn't matter. We want to show that we want to be friends. But the Americans had no such intention. The Americans began to really flay the Soviets. You know, what is Gorky? Why is Sakharov in Gorky? What are you doing in Afghanistan? Da-da-da-da-da-da. And of course, initially, the Soviets were kind of shocked, but they came right back and said, yeah, what about Vietnam? What about racism? What about this? What about that? We started yelling at each other until a young man in a leather jacket, I remember him very well, a fisherman, that was his profession, handsome guy from Seattle, got up and he said, what are we doing? This is precisely what our governments want us to do. Is this why we've come together? And it was amazing. People started crying. They just poured out, you know, and that was probably the best illustration I've ever seen of the desire to overcome the barrier that had been placed between us by stupid, evil people who were actually ready to go to war. For what? For what? Unwinnable war, what's more. Unwinnable. And it was seen in the Soviet Union by just about everybody because there was only really one television network. So people pretty much had no choice, but it was like a bomb. They'd never seen anything like this. They'd never heard anyone criticizing them on television. It was just a completely, you know, unheard of thing. Fewer people saw it in America because only the stations that took the Donahue show agreed to take it, and even not all of them. So about 8 million people versus about 140 million in the Soviet Union. But it was a huge, huge success. It changed people's minds. To this day, people come up to me and say, we'll never forget that. We'll never forget it. And you know, I'm supposed to take credit for it. I was part of it. I was the host because of my English. And because in America, people knew me. They'd seen me on television. So that's why I was chosen. But I'm certainly not, again, for me, the real hero of this whole thing was Golden, Joseph Golden. So that's what happened back then. And in my opinion, what we have to do, I totally agree with what Cynthia says about fighting nuclear testing. We in Russia, we have over 6,000 missiles. In America, also over 6,000. The Chinese say, well, when you cut down to our number, we'll talk to you. They have 200. That would be a hell of a thing to cut down to 200. But you know, 200 is enough to destroy the planet, let alone 400 or 600. So when you talk about overkill, I mean, boy, that's really overkill, all right? But the way to overcome this, in my opinion, is human contact. You've got to break through these walls that have been built over the years by the media in both countries. I absolutely cannot put the blame more on America than on Russia, and by the politicians who, in my opinion, are blind. They don't see what they're doing. The effort, there should be a concentrated effort to bring Russians and Americans together, not to separate them, not to find ways to make them fear each other or hate each other, which is exactly what's going on right now. And it's been going on for many, many years. I think that maybe it's the task of younger people to try to figure out how to deal with this. What with all the new technology that exists. For instance, you know, I'm a very old man, and I say this with a smile because I don't feel that way, but objectively speaking, I am. And you know, all of these new technologies, I'm not very familiar with. I mean, I managed today to hook up very quickly, but you know, that's not really much of a thing. But there should be a real effort on the part of as many people as possible. How do we contact each other? How do we talk to each other? Climbing the mountain is a great illustration. It really, you know, we're on the same rope. Either we get up there together or we fall to the abyss. Wonderful picture, should be used. But how do we actually bring them together? I've always said we should try to get as many American kids as possible to come over here for a year, live in homes, go to Russian schools, and vice versa. Have Russian kids go to America, as many as possible, hopefully thousands, hopefully, because that involves not just the kids, it involves the parents. They're going to talk to each other as well. How's my son doing? Is he still doing all those terrible things he does at home? Or have you managed somehow to take care of him? You know, you get into personal relationships there, personal relationships. I think that should be the grand goal. I was enchanted by the idea of planting 1 trillion trees. It's a wonderful symbol again, and it can be done. It can be done. I think that basically groups, organizations, call them whatever you want, who want to get out of the rut that we're in, should focus on not too many things at the same time. You know, like for instance, contacts and tree planting, 2 of those, you know, and then just keep it there. Don't go any further because you're going to you're going to bite off more than you can swallow. You know what I'm saying? But I think this calls for serious thought. This is serious business. And I'm not at all optimistic. I'm not optimistic because I see what's going on every day. Sure, there are us, you and me and some other people out there, but we're not calling the shots. We are not calling the shots. And we're not being heard properly. And we should be heard.
This, Vladimir, you are talking a lot about the importance of human contact. Do you believe that actually journalists today can also make a difference?
You know, you touched on a very sore spot. I feel that journalism today has been betrayed. What is the, well, let me back up. I think there are 3 professions where duty is paramount, the most important thing. One is a doctor. The second is a priest. And the third is a journalist. There is a duty that you have. The case of a journalist is a duty unto your audience. And your duty is to inform that audience as objectively as you possibly can. You're not a robot. As truthfully as you possibly can, and you know when you're lying or when you're telling a half-truth. And as fully as you possibly can, give them the full scope, and then say, now, you decide what's right and what's wrong. Don't try to make them think what you think. Give them the possibility. Theoretically, yes, the media could, but in practice, the media is doing the opposite. It is supporting and spreading hatred and fear and distrust. That's what it's doing all the time.
And it's up probably to the younger generation like Brenna and Natalia and all the other news group members to think whether using possibly alternative channels of information, other online media sources or
Absolutely.
social.
You know that in Russia, people, the bloggers, the non-official media, if you will, has more people watching, listening to it than mainstream media. And I think that's a very positive thing. It's very positive because when they go to those sources, they get much more facts than, or much more truth, shall we say, than they do in mainstream media. But it's still far from what it should be. I think young people should understand, well, all people, but in this case, they have a life to live. They have a life to live. Do they want to have children? How do they, do they think about the future? These are all very serious matters. And I think that they should be brought home as often as possible. I would like to speak to large numbers of young people. I'm sure I could get through to them, and I'm sure I would get some kind of response. I've done it here in Russia. When I speak, wherever it may be, it's usually 80% people under the age of 25, which is strange when you consider how old I am. But nonetheless, I think these are all very important matters.
But I can confirm to you, Vladimir, that you are a real hero to all of us. And actually, talking about the space bridges, I would feel you were a little bit too modest, saying that you were just a host. You were also a very charismatic host. And this is why I would ask Ryan now to play one of the parts of the space bridges for us to see both how you were and also to get a better feeling of it. And thank you so much, Cynthia, for providing this beautiful piece to us.
We believe that public opinion and popular protest as expressed in the United States can be a corrective.
Freedom of speech is a great thing, but if nobody listens to that speech, then what use is its freedom?
We're very worried about missiles in West Germany, cruise missiles in the UK, in Holland, in the Netherlands, and the rest of Europe. Why are these missiles in Europe? So I would like to ask, what's the American view of this? What about these missiles in Europe? They shouldn't be there, should they?
I would agree with you. They shouldn't be there. But I remember that during the Carter administration, and we had a president, President Carter, who some Americans considered very soft. And during his administration, he de-emphasized military buildup in America. And while he was doing that, the Soviets had the largest military buildup in the history of the Soviet Union, of which a large percentage of it was in Eastern Germany. And maybe that's why we're concerned, and maybe that's why those missiles are there in Western Germany.
22 million Russian people died in World War II, and my dream is that someday Vietnam veterans will be able someday to get together with Afghanistan veterans from your society. Yes, you two men wearing that uniform, sitting there in that audience, and be able to talk about how wrong war is and how futile it is. And it will be the burden of the Afghanistan veteran and Vietnam veterans to spread to the rest of our two respective societies the futility and wrongness of war. Thank you.
What do you feel about us? What do you think about us? What do you think about our lives?
We really want to be friends with you as much as you do with us. We extend our hands to you, and we'd like to see a lot more friendship, understanding, and trust.
I ask you, Vladimir, how you feel about what has transpired here?
I have very complex feelings about what happened. I'm very pleased that it's happened. But what happened has indicated, very precisely, I think, how difficult it is for us to talk with each other. I don't want to sound flippant, but in the musical My Fair Lady, there is a refrain when Higgins is amazed at Lisa says, why can't a woman be more like a man? And today, I think that if we've at least understood this on both sides, that we are in fact different, that each of us has its own viewpoint, and that it's worth something. This will be a first step, albeit a trembling one, but a first step towards understanding. And when we understand, then we will no longer be afraid of each other. There'll be no paranoia. There'll be normal conversation. First and foremost, we have to understand. This is my feeling about today's meeting.
Beautiful, beautiful. This is exactly what Vladimir was referring to. Now, 30 years fast forward, and we have Brenna Gautam, our very active CTBTO youth group member, joining us. Brenna, tell us, why did you actually decided to get involved in promoting the comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty? And what made you feel you want to invest your time in the issues of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, which, as we've discussed earlier today, might not be as trendy or as, well seen or well discussed as they were 30 years ago?
Sure, Maria. Well, so being from the United States and being a younger person from the United States, I didn't grow up knowing about nuclear weapons. It wasn't taught in school, and it wasn't really part of the conversation in the same way that terrorism we might see as a threat, or even climate change as a threat. It just wasn't part of that conversation for me, at least. So I didn't even know the first thing about nuclear weapons until higher education, until college. And for me, it was taking a history class, and it was actually Cold War history that kind of first inspired me. I learned about my own country's history as the first nuclear weapon state, the only state to have used a nuclear weapon in wartime, and just this long history of nuclear testing and detonation. So learning that about your own country and being a citizen there, I felt, and just in my own personal opinion, that I also had a kind of moral responsibility to not just have learned about it, but actually to do something about it. And then it wasn't until law school when I found out about the CYG, I thought it was such a unique opportunity having this international organization prioritizing youth and elevating youth voices. And learning more through the CYG about the issue of testing in particular, the fact that there are survivors today and descendants of survivors today who deal with the impact of nuclear tests. And then just meeting this community of young people who were all interested in really grappling with that issue and just trying to make the world a little bit safer in that way. So once I learned all that, and once I went to one conference that was hosted by the CTBTO, I felt like I had to get involved.
And what actually inspires you today? What makes you hope for the better? Because we've heard a lot both from Cynthia and from Vladimir, especially from Vladimir, who was saying, I would not be so enthusiastic or optimistic about what's happening these days. Do you have some hope? And what do you rely on when seeing a better future?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard because it is a concerning, like we're in 2020 right now, and being a young person who cares about peace and this issue, it can be concerning. One thing that brings me hope is the fact that nuclear weapons are not being seen as just strictly a security issue. They're not being seen as a topic that's like solely for military discussion, or even solely for older, more experienced professionals. The fact that youth are being invited to share our perspectives and our opinions is important. And I'm also inspired by the linkages between nuclear weapons and human rights issues and environmental consequences, and the sustainable development goals. In my opinion, nothing is really just a security issue. There's always some human story behind it. And I think Cynthia so brilliantly shared hers with us. And it was just maybe in the past that those stories were not included in the narrative in the same way that I see them being included today through groups like the CYG. At a microcosm, our membership is so diverse. I'm an attorney, Natalia, her background is in international relations. We have scientists and engineers and even artists and all kinds of different young people. And it's inspiring to me to see that kind of diversity, because I think it really does have the potential to lead to innovation. We talked a little earlier about the CTBTO and the way they're thinking through some technologies that were originally just thought of as, how can this technology be used to detect nuclear tests? And now thinking through civil and scientific applications that are so innovative, early warning to detect tsunamis, whale research, like all kinds of different applications. And so I think the CTBTO has been at the forefront of that. And for me as a young person, from my background, I just value that kind of diversity and innovation, and I take a lot of hope from it.
And how do you see citizen diplomacy today, Brenna?
Well, I think that, again, I view the CYG as like a small piece of citizen diplomacy, just because we have members from all of these different countries and all of these different backgrounds. To me, the thing I'm concerned about is public education and information. It doesn't escape me that I was very privileged with my college education and my law school education, but I could have gone through all that never having really learned about or grappled with issues relating to nuclear weapons, or even just international relations more generally. So I think that a hurdle to citizen diplomacy is kind of the theme of this, the wake-up call that we all need. It's exciting to me that when you join the CYG, you're given this free access to information on the treaty and kind of an education component, but it's definitely concerning to me that there's just so much work to be done in kind of rooting through the noise and all these other important issues and trying to make sure that this issue, which is a matter of life and death, is not left out of the conversation.
And what I actually love about the group that you are part of, the CTBTO youth group, is that you can talk to each other and you connect between different countries, between various profiles and generations, and that you are building together this community. And my feeling is this can actually be the future of the citizen diplomacy, those interpersonal connections, interpersonal links then can further on help also open maybe not a window of opportunity, but at least, as we call it in Russia, a fortechka of opportunity, which is a tiny, small window. Natalia, Brenna mentioned the importance of breaking the silos when working on issues related to disarmament and non-proliferation. How do you see that?
Thank you, Maria. Well, I agree that this field is considered a very specialized domain, and that, well, actually it can be changed through the citizen diplomacy. And I think that this was exactly what was done during the Cold War era. So in the midst of the arms race between the two superpowers, people came up with those initiatives, like citizen diplomacy initiatives, aimed to improve bilateral relations on people-to-people level. such as those initiatives that Cynthia and Vladimir was telling us about, like Peace Child, space bridges, etc. But also the nuclear threat, which seemed at that time very real and very close, inspired many other people. So a lot of songs were written, a lot of movies were produced, and for instance, Dr. Strangelove, or the movie The Day After about the consequences of the nuclear war, which was actually so effective that it depressed President Ronald Reagan and had a direct effect on his desire to end nuclear proliferation during his presidency. So it all counted, and I think that through those initiatives, both governments got the understanding that people didn't want a war, and maybe this was one of the reasons why the war didn't happen. So the history shows us that the citizen diplomacy works, and today, according to the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, we are closer to a nuclear catastrophe than we were during the Cold War. And since we don't see many efforts from our governments to at least reduce nuclear armaments, I think that we ordinary people need to take the lead and demonstrate that we stay against the nuclear war, and we want our countries to be partners and not enemies. And I hope that our today's webinar will provide us with some ideas on what we can do.
You have also been very active in engaging new people. Like both of you, Brenna and Natalia, you're like absolutely amazing in terms of getting newcomers up to speed on the issues. Why do you think this is important, and what are your main principles when doing it?
Well, I think that, I know that nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation can be frustrating, but I think that the most important is to be passionate about what you're doing, and then everything is achievable. The greatest thing about the CTBTO youth group is that we are independent. We don't represent official positions of our governments, which allows us to speak openly on these topics. And our views may differ, and but the one thing that we all agree on is the urgency of the entry into force of the CTBT. And I think that the CTBTO has been doing a great job on educating young scholars on the nuclear threat and nurturing the new generation of leaders concerned about the international peace and security. And I'm convinced that our generation will bring the treaty into force. And if some of the new CTBTO youth group members are watching us and don't know how to what to start with, I would suggest to start with something small. Start with raising awareness about the importance of the treaty in your communities. Start with your family, your friends, colleagues, classmates. And I'm sure that the more people are aware of the importance of the treaty, the sooner it will enter into force. And no matter how small you consider what you are doing, anyway, it is a small step towards achieving the ultimate goal, and in the end, it all counts. And I remember we had this CYG member from the US. She was a student, but she also worked as barista. And at her job, she served coffee with nuclear latte art. So she literally was serving coffee with the images of the nuclear explosions or nuclear missiles. And that was how she was starting conversations with her clients on the nuclear danger. And it was her way of raising awareness about the nuclear threat. And who knows, maybe one day a representative of her government will visit the cafeteria, order a coffee, and it will make him reconsider the nuclear policy of his country. So, I mean, who knows? It is a chain reaction that you can't predict, but it really works. I just want the CYG members to understand that what you that you can make a difference, and whatever you do to raise awareness about the nuclear threat is important, and even one cup of coffee can change history, so it all counts.
I can see everyone on the screen smiling when you are telling the story, and I absolutely love it as well. Actually, my question would now go, I think, to all four of our keynote speakers. So any one of you can pick it up. It's about the link about sustainable development and the larger nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. How can they be linked to each other? And how can we capitalize on linking both of them? Cynthia, as you have taken the lead on promoting a number of those initiatives, would you like to be the first one to step in?
Sure. Well, I think that, nuclear weapons were developed in the 20th century, and back then, they were seen as a way of making us more secure, which was an illusion. It was absolutely not true. This policy of mutually assured destruction as a way to make us more secure was insane then, and it's insane now. But I think it's really much more apparent today to many people, because we're living in a time where nuclear weapons obviously can do nothing to help us address the two other existential threats that we're facing right now, the pandemic and climate change. In fact, the opposite is true. It's really clear. In the United States, we have more nuclear weapons than hospitals. Imagine that. More nuclear weapons than hospitals. And we have had severe shortages in our country of ventilators, ICU beds, masks, basic essential medical supplies and equipment that are needed to save lives. And when you think about this, these are urgently needed. Lives have been lost because we haven't had them. And last year in 2019 in the world, we spent over $73 billion on nuclear weapons globally and 1.9 trillion on militarism and preparations for war. So if we just think about these resources that are being wasted on these weapons of mass destruction and on war, and how desperately they're needed for things like addressing the pandemic and climate change and poverty and hunger and all of the sustainable development goals. Just imagine what we could do with those resources. That's real security. That the sustainable development goals are real security. So we need to really be very focused on something that people haven't talked about for a long time, but many are. Where's the money going? Converting these resources. Imagine if we had, trillions to spend on all the things that are really going to make us more secure, that we can care for each other, for the climate, for the planet, for the earth. That's where I think we need to see the connections. Is how nuclear weapons are, first of all, an existential threat of annihilation and insane to have around at this time, but also the money that's being spent on them and on war is diverting what we most need now for our security in our time.
This actually helps tell a very compelling story, because as our event today is devoted to storytelling for change, I believe giving those live examples is extremely powerful to get people to connect and to understand what's actually going on. Vladimir, would you have an advice to the youth group members joining us how to tell a compelling story to raise awareness about the nuclear threat?
I wish I could say yes, but I don't think I have any advice. I don't know. I don't know how to do this. Frankly, I think that I think we should get together, a group of people. I don't know how many, maybe 15, 20, 25 people, and do some brainstorming. I don't think I can just come up with, here's the idea, bing, bing, bang, bang. I think it's too serious an issue. We should forget about the military-industrial complex about which President Eisenhower wrote back in 1960, I think it was, for Look magazine. There's huge money invested in weapons of mass destruction. There are huge profits that are made. These are very powerful people. with very powerful organizations. So it's a very difficult task. I think it's a doable one, but I do think that we should come together, people who are really interested in this, and create some kind of forum and spend, I don't know, 3 days really brainstorming this and working out some kind of a platform, and then having a press conference, inviting journalists from different countries and announcing that this is what we're going to do and this is what people should know. And it'll get through. It'll get through. But I don't think just we're talking like we are now that we can really map out a strategy. I don't think so.
With this, we conclude today's online event. Thank you so much who attended it today with us. You are helping us build a nuclear test-free world, one webinar at a time. Before we conclude, a quote from Mother Teresa, because I think it summarizes really well the discussion we had today. We ourselves might feel that what we do is just a little drop in the ocean, but without this drop, the ocean will be much more shallow. The CYG webinars will continue in 2 weeks' time with a number of exciting events. Thank you so much again. Watch the recording of this webinar, which will be made public. And with this, many thanks to our keynote speakers, to Cynthia, Brenna, Natalia, and of course, Vladimir, for their time today.